$1,000,000 invested at an average return of 8% generates roughly $80,000 a year. That's a salary without a job. On paper, that's freedom. But here's the strange part. Ask people who've actually crossed that seven-figure line what changed their life, and most of them don't point to the million. They point backward to the first $10,000 sitting untouched in an account. Why would a number that small matter more than 100 times its size? Because this isn't a math story. This is a story about what I call the reverse operating trap. A structure where the order you handle money determines whether you climb out or sink deeper. And most people are running the sequence backward without realizing it. I'm not a financial advisor. This is observation, not financial guidance. Here's how personal finances operate for most working adults. Paycheck arrives. Fixed expenses take their cut: rent, utilities, insurance, minimum payments. Then variable spending fills in the rest: groceries, gas, the ordinary friction of being alive. Whatever's left over, if anything is left over, gets saved. That sequence feels logical. It even feels responsible. But it contains a design flaw that's easy to miss. Saving sits at the end of the line. It only happens when every other category has already been satisfied. And every other category is bottomless. There's always a bill slightly larger than expected. A copay that wasn't budgeted. A price increase that went unnoticed for 2 months. By the time life finishes taking its cut, the leftover is zero or close enough to zero that moving it anywhere feels pointless. This isn't a discipline failure. It's a sequencing failure. The operating order places the most important financial function, building a buffer, in the most vulnerable position. Last in line. First to get cut. That's the first layer of the reverse operating trap. The structure turns sufficient income into permanent insufficiency, not because the money isn't there, but because the order eliminates it before it can accumulate. When there's no buffer, every unplanned expense costs more than its face value, not metaphorically, literally. The sequence runs like this. An unexpected cost appears. There's no cash reserve to cover it. The only options available are tools that carry additional costs. Credit cards with interest installment plans with fees, short-term borrowing with strings attached. Those additional costs reduce next month's usable income, which makes it even harder to build a buffer, which means the next unplanned expense triggers the same cycle again. Possibly worse. I keep thinking of it like driving a car with no spare tire. When a flat happens, and flats do happen, the person without a spare doesn't just lose a tire. They pay for the tow. They pay rush pricing at whatever shop is closest. They miss a day of work. They might get a ticket for stopping where they shouldn't. The same flat tire, but the total cost is 3 or 4 times higher than it would have been with a $30 spare sitting in the trunk. That multiplier effect is what I'd call the invisible tax. It doesn't show up on any pay stub. No one sends an invoice for it. But it quietly extracts money from every paycheck of every person running on empty. And the cruel part is, it's regressive. The less buffer someone has, the more they pay in friction costs. The system charges the highest rates to the people with the fewest options. There's another cost that doesn't show up in dollars at all. When a bank account has no margin, the brain shifts into a continuous low-grade alert state. It's not panic, it's surveillance. Scanning. Running background calculations that never fully stop. Every notification from the banking app triggers a small stress response. Every auto payment date feels like a countdown. Every unexpected phone call could be a collector, a landlord, a bill that slipped through the cracks. That constant vigilance is metabolically expensive. The brain doesn't distinguish well between real danger and possible danger. It processes both with the same neurochemical urgency. and over weeks and months that sustained alertness drains cognitive capacity the way a background app drains a phone battery. Nothing is visibly broken. Everything just runs slower. Think about a computer with 47 browser tabs open simultaneously. It still works. The screen still lights up, but every task takes twice as long, every program lags, and the fan runs non-stop. Someone watching from the outside sees a slow computer. What they don't see is the invisible load consuming all the processing power. The operating loop at this layer, no buffer to brain, stays in surveillance mode. To cumulative cognitive fatigue. To decision quality, declines to financial choices become more short-term and more emotional to money, continues to leak to still no buffer. The loop closes itself. $10,000 doesn't make anyone wealthy. It doesn't solve systemic problems. It doesn't even cover a serious medical emergency in most parts of the country. But for a significant number of working adults, it falls somewhere in the range of 2 to 4 months of baseline living costs. And that range is where something shifts, not in the bank account, but in the operating mode of the brain. The surveillance state begins to quiet down. The decision window expands from hours to weeks. The menu of available options gets wider, not unlimited, but wider than take the first thing offered or go under. And here's where the comparison to $1 million becomes interesting. The behavioral distance between someone with 900,000 and someone with $1 million is almost zero. They think the same way. They react to problems the same way. They negotiate from roughly the same position. But the behavioral distance between someone with 0 and someone with 10,000 is enormous. Everything changes how they respond to emergencies, how they evaluate job offers, how they handle a broken appliance, how they sleep. The largest gap in financial behavior doesn't live at the top of the ladder. It lives at the bottom, between nothing and something, between running the system empty and having just enough margin for the system to function differently. That's what makes the first 10,000 more consequential than the million. It doesn't change the balance. It changes the operating system. Marcus and Devin are both 29. Both work mid-level office jobs in the same city. Both take home roughly $4,200 a month after taxes. On paper, they're the same person. Marcus has no financial buffer. His checking account typically hovers somewhere between $200 and $600 by the last week of the month. Not because he's reckless, because the math just never leaves room for accumulation. Devin has about $12,000 sitting in a separate account he doesn't touch. Not an investment. Not a brokerage. Just cash doing nothing except existing. In October, both of their cars need a repair. Transmission issue. The quote comes in at $1,900. Devin's experience. He's frustrated. Nobody enjoys a $1,900 surprise, but he calls 2 shops. Compares quotes, picks the one with better reviews, even though it's slightly more expensive. The car is fixed in 4 days. He transfers the money from his buffer account notes that he wants to replenish it over the next 2 months and moves on with his week. Marcus's experience. He doesn't have $1,900. He starts calculating. Rent is due in 9 days. The electric bill auto pays on the 15th. He considers asking his brother for a loan, but they just went through that 6 months ago. He finds a shop willing to do a partial fix for $800 on a credit card. The car runs for 3 weeks, and then the same problem resurfaces worse now. The full repair ends up costing $2,400 because the partial fix created additional damage. That $2,400 is now sitting on a credit card at 22%. APR. Minimum payments will stretch it across 14 months. The total cost with interest closer to $2,900. Same car. Same breakdown. Same income level. One person paid $1,900 and lost 4 days. The other paid $2,900, carried stress for months, and entered the next billing cycle with less margin than before. The difference wasn't earnings. It wasn't intelligence. It wasn't work ethic. It was the presence or absence of a buffer and the cascade of secondary costs that absence creates. But here's something worth observing. $10,000 doesn't mean the same thing everywhere. In a mid-cost city, say Raleigh or Columbus, where a person's essential monthly costs might land around $2,800 to $3,200, $10,000 covers roughly 3 months of survival. That's a meaningful cushion. In San Francisco or Manhattan, where rent alone can consume $2,500 or more, that same $10,000 might cover 6 weeks. Maybe less. The buffer is thinner. The margin for error is smaller. The surveillance mode in the brain stays active longer. And in lower-cost regions, rural areas, smaller towns, parts of the South or Midwest, $10,000 could stretch 5, 6, even 7 months. Same dollar amount, but functionally a different kind of safety. The number on the screen is not the number that matters. What matters is the ratio. How many months of baseline survival does this amount represent? That ratio determines how far the brain can shift out of emergency mode. The system doesn't respond to absolute figures. It responds to runway. There's one more pattern worth naming because it tends to show up right at this stage, the moment someone recognizes how important the first $10,000 is and starts feeling the pressure to get there faster. That urgency is where certain offers find their audience. Copy trading platforms promising passive returns by mirroring expert accounts. Group chats promoting guaranteed monthly yields of 3 to 5%. Crypto signals. Forex mentors. Investment pools that require trust but offer no transparency. The structure behind most of these is observable. Early participants receive returns funded by later participants. The performance screenshots are real until they aren't. And the people most vulnerable to these pitches are precisely the ones trying to build their first financial cushion, because the gap between where they are and where they need to be feels so urgent that speed becomes more attractive than caution. What happens next is predictable. The money intended to become a buffer becomes someone else's revenue, and the person returns to the starting position, except now with less trust in the process and more emotional weight than before. Impatience is not a character flaw, but in this particular system, it functions as a raw material that others can monetize. There's a belief running in the background of most people's financial thinking, and it rarely gets examined out loud. Money sitting still is money being wasted. If there's $10,000 in an account, earning next to nothing, not invested, not compounding, not working, then something must be wrong. You're falling behind. Inflation is eating it. Your coworker just posted returns from their brokerage. Some guy on a podcast said idle cash is a losing strategy. That belief creates a specific kind of pressure, not to spend the money, but to deploy it. Move it somewhere. Make it do something. And that pressure leads to one of two outcomes. The buffer gets invested into something illiquid or volatile, which means it's no longer usable when life breaks, or it gets spent incrementally, because if it's just sitting there, it might as well buy something tangible. Either way, the buffer disappears. Not through carelessness, through a mental framework that categorizes stillness as failure. But here's what that framework misses. A buffer isn't idle money. It's actively preventing losses that never show up on a spreadsheet. The late fees that don't happen. The high-interest borrowing that isn't needed. The job offer that can be declined because there's enough runway to wait for a better one. The medical issue that gets treated early instead of ignored until it becomes expensive. None of these savings are visible, but they're real, and over time, they often exceed whatever return the money could have generated elsewhere. And there's something deeper that I keep noticing, something harder to quantify. For people who grew up in households where money was always scarce, the experience of having a buffer can feel genuinely uncomfortable. Not relieving. Uncomfortable. Like holding something that doesn't belong to them. When that discomfort builds, the brain looks for a way back to familiar territory. And familiar territory is a low balance, so the spending happens not from greed, not from poor planning, but from a nervous system trying to return to the only state it recognizes as normal. That's not a lack of discipline. That's an old operating system resisting a new one. And recognizing that pattern doesn't fix it instantly, but it does interrupt the cycle of self-blame that usually follows when the money quietly vanishes and no one can explain where it went. The problem was never you spend too much. The problem is structural sequence placement and a set of invisible beliefs about what money is supposed to do. The first $10,000 matters more than the million because it changes the operating mode from survival to choice. That single shift determines the quality of every financial decision that follows the real cost of every unexpected event and whether the system pulls a person deeper in or finally lets them move. $1 million is a destination. 10,000 is the door out of the waiting room. This channel doesn't give advice. It observes how the paycheck system operates and where it runs against the interests of the people inside it. No advice, just observation. But this isn't the full picture. Even after understanding the trap, there's another force, quieter, more persistent, that keeps millions of working adults locked in a state where they earn enough to survive, but never enough to accumulate. That's what the next video is about.